All right, so the first bit, really up until now, I treat that as sort of setting the scene and getting an understanding of what you think is important and what's not, and what we should sort of focus on. I now want to sort of move our attention to what do I think is then appropriate, given that's a state of play, given all the uncertainty, given all the different players in there and the rules changing and all that sort of stuff and things that haven't been worked out. What the hell should we do? And we've started to sort of get to it with, I think we just need to start collecting some of our numbers. So the first one I really want to touch on, and I separate out understanding your emissions and addressing your emissions before I even bother thinking about carbon sequestration projects. I just separate them out as two separate things because there's a hell of a lot we can do now in the emission side of that equation. So if you think of that diagram of the scope 1 and scope 2 stuff, a hell of a lot we can do in that space before you worry about the trees and the soils bit. And unfortunately, everybody wants to go to the trees and soils bit and what carbon project you're going to run. And there's huge opportunity in this emission space. First bit, as was alluded to, get to understand your emissions and just where they're sitting. There's a large number of calculators that you can use to calculate your emissions. I've just put a few up here. What I'll call the most common ones you may have heard of, the greenhouse accounting frameworks, which are from the University of Melbourne. There's the MLA carbon calculator and the DGAS calculator. That's MLA are running with that one. Dairy Australia are running with that one. Both of them use the same assumptions that's in the GAF tool, these greenhouse accounting framework tools. So they're basically the same. They just put a stick on to make them look a bit better, but the engine behind it is exactly the same. And they're the links to them if you want to go to it. So Ruminati was a private group, a couple of farmers that got together and produced a online version of the tool. When they first did it, they tried to simplify some of the calculations, as MLA have got a very simplified version of that as well. They've now gone back to using the same assumptions that are in the GAF tool up here. And then there's other tools like Cool Farm Tools, which is a European-based thing to do calculations, supported by a lot of European companies, agricultural companies, so they can get the carbon footprint on the products that they're buying. It tends to be more of a individual crop basis rather than a whole farm basis in the calculations. And the assumptions that are used in that are different to the assumptions that are used in the Australian standards. The GAF tools and these ones that it's been built from, the GAF tool uses the Australian standards, what's called the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory Standards. And it's the same standards that have evolved out of the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Agreement. So the calculations that you're doing at the farm level are exactly the same equations and assumptions and calculations that they use to create those national inventories. That's where those graphs have been generated from that you saw of emissions across Australia and different enterprises. And therefore they are consistent with the way Australia is reporting. The downside with that is that the level of how granular they are at a farm level and how precise they are at a farm level is pretty crap. And that's because they're built off a national model that uses high level data. So there's lots of things that you would expect would be asked as questions to do the calculation at a farm level. They're not, because historically they have come from the national calculator. So when Richard put these together in the Climate Challenges Centre, probably about 15 years ago now, when he did his first version of them, they were in response to Australia signing the Kyoto Protocol and trying to bring that down to the farm level. So when you look at some of the questions that are asked, you look at the seasons, say, for example, if it's livestock, the classes of livestock they've been classified into, it's all because the Australian government only had that level of data from ABARES and ABS, and therefore names and numbers. and levels of frequency of data collection, because that's the only data the Australian government had. We are now trying to take a national calculator and turn it into something at a farm level. And there are some obvious limitations you can probably imagine because of that. Trying to overcome this, about 12 months ago, all of the RDCs, because they were all trying to do calculations around greenhouse, invested some money and set up an independent company called Agricultural Innovation Australia, or AIA. And their first task was to create a platform, an online platform, where all of these other platforms are Excel-based, an online platform that could be automatically updated over time, and that you could build your own farm system in that, and it would track from year to year. And as assumptions changed, it would automatically backdate and recalculate your assumptions. That has had what they call a soft launch. I'm still working through with them and giving them calculations. I've got a meeting again this Friday with them. It's not quite working the way it should be at the moment, so there's still a few limitations. I will show you briefly what it looks like so that you're aware of it, but I wouldn't be using it yet until we iron a few of the other bugs out of it. But this will be the new generation of where people put their calculations or do their calculations. It is based on the GAF frameworks, so it is consistent with the Australian government's frameworks. The beauty about it is it's not Excel based. So it means that as things change, they are changed automatically and in a sense protected in the background, and you can't bugger it up that you can in Excel spreadsheets. And you can do 1 year rolling into the next year, and it keeps all your data where the GAF tool doesn't. So there'll be limitations when we dig a bit more into the tools. That I've got down here, I've just put these in. These are in the sequestration side of it. This is probably the best tool that's available if you want to have a bit of a crack about how you might accumulate soil carbon. It's called Socrates. It's run by Peter Grace at Queensland Uni. And it allows you to see a change over time in soil carbon under certain changes in biomass production. So whether you go cropping or grazing and stuff like that, it's pretty limited in the way it works. It does work off what's called the Roth-C model. So that's the worldwide sort of standardized carbon model in a simplified form. So that's one of them. The second one is a program called FullCAM, which I'll show you as well, the Full Carbon Accounting Model. It's run by the Australian Department, and it is used to estimate carbon accumulation in trees, in vegetation. So these two at the bottom are two tools that we use for carbon sequestration. But what I really want to focus on are these tools at the top. And in particular, forget about these two that are privately run, and we'll focus a little bit more about these tools up here. So these are the tools from, and I imagine most people have gone to the PIC Centre and gone and seen the tools. So GAF just stands for Greenhouse Accounting Framework, and the letters just try and give you an indication of the type of enterprise it is. So GGAF is the cropping one, grains, SB is sheep, beef, and so on. You'll notice that they have different versions on them. And each of those versions is because they'll put a version out and then the rules will change a bit and they update the calculators so they recalculate again. When I did the cropping one for Marcus Oldham a month ago, we were version 10.7, we're now version 11. So I had to redo all the calculations because they've made changes to it. If you want to know what changes they make time they make a change to the calculation, what have they made and why, what's the reference behind making it. But bottom line is that these change all the time. So if you're doing a calculation with a client, just make sure you're using the latest version. And if you've done a calculation, an old calculation with a client and the version has changed, it's quite possible those two numbers aren't comparable at the moment, because there might be an assumption about the global warming potential of one of the gases in there, or the amount of nitrous oxide that comes off leaching and runoff. If they've changed that, then the old version will be using the old calculation, the new version will be using a new one. So you just need to be aware of always using the latest version to try and get the latest data, and your old data, if you've done it, may be redundant. This tool, the AIA tool, which is the online one, will overcome a lot of that, because that AIA tool will allow you to update it. Any changes that are made will automatically update and will recalculate any old data that you've put in there before. I might stop sharing there and just give you a bit of a flavour. No, actually, we'll go through and do the Excel ones and then I'll come back to this a bit later on. Okay, so the message out of all of this is that the tools that we'll be using will be roughly right but precisely wrong at the farm level. And it's because there are assumptions in them, and some of those assumptions are statewide. So if you click on a state, it assumes the whole of the state is like this. It assumes that if you've got animals, that every cow weighs this amount at this time of year. Okay? That the quality of your pasture across the whole state will be like this. So you can obviously see that there are there'll be variations in that, and so at a global level, at a very high level, it probably is okay. You can get away with it. It becomes more of a frustration when you get down to the farm level. They just need to keep that in mind. You just need to tell the people you're working with that these are the limitations of it because of the history of where it's come from. People are working hard to tidy that up, but it's still going to be a way before we get to that point. The important thing, though, is that the data that you need to either do this stuff over here in the Excel spreadsheet or this stuff here is the same. So even though the assumptions and the calculations and the interface may look different, the core numbers that you need will be the same. Okay, so don't start until this one's perfect, because you can still be doing a lot in this, and while it's a little bit of work, you can transfer it across. So I might jump down. Sorry, I'm going to flick through a whole lot of these and find the, here we go. In your pack, all of these different files, and I'll just alert you to them and then we'll come back to them later on, but I'll tell you they exist now. Okay? There will be a number of 2 Excel spreadsheets that are used to help in the collection and the collation of the data that you need to enter into the GAF tools. Okay, so these ones is a fertilizer composition table. So if you didn't know what the MPKS of MAP was, you can type in MAP and it will show you what that is. So it's a simple lookup table. Melbourne Uni put that together. I've created one here because one of the inputs that you need to put in is how much chemical you use, and it's not based on litres, it's based on active ingredient, so the kilogram of product. So I've got a simple spreadsheet I've created here. So when you put the chemical in and the rate, it automatically looks up and will follow that calculation through. So you look at the bottom of it and it will just tell you what number you need to transfer across into the Excel spreadsheet. So you've got a couple of those, which will make more sense when we start playing with it in a half an hour or so. I've also stuck in this paper here, the CSIRO one, only came out through the Australian Farm Institute, came out last month, and it's really talking about the challenges that farmers might have with getting information around Scope 3 emissions and how we should tackle that. It's quite a useful little paper about how we tackle that Scope 3 issue, which at the moment is incredibly coarse in the calculators. So that's, again, a bit of background reading, so you're up to speed with where the latest thinking is on that and where it's going. On the right-hand side, I've created a number of example farms for you. Now, I've only created these farms so you can see what it should look like. You can see the sort of inputs that are required, and you can see the sort of outputs that you've. Example farm, so there's that 9.1, that's the old version 10.7. In fact, you could probably exclude that one and we'll just work with the 11.0. And then I've also created a grains greenhouse one, but I've put some entries for nitrogen inhibitors that we can obviously buy at the moment, and they're almost ready to hit the calculators and be included in the calculators. They're not in this version, but I've put them in this version and checked with Rich and all the calculations are right. So it's a bit of a heads up. You can't get that online. That's a private one that you've got that I'm supplying to you now, but it allows you to have a play of, do we bother with these urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors on some of the fertilizers that we use, and what impact that might have. So I've stuck that one in there as well. And then I've put in a Word document an example farm and changing 4 or 5 scenarios. So what if we did this? What if we did that? What if we reduced our fuel use by 25% in this mock farm? What impact would it have? So it gives you an opportunity to start to see some of the impacts different items that go into the calculation have on the final result. And I've done the same thing for a cattle one and the same thing for a sheep one. So I'm just giving you the heads up on those. We'll open them up in a minute, but I just wanted to let you know all of that stuff is sitting there, so you've got examples. I use these examples myself, but they suit the farming systems and the areas that I work in. They're probably not going to suit yours, so you probably will want to make your own that suit the local audience and the type of farming system they're using. But at least you've got an example there that you can play around with. All right, let me go back to the top bit up here. Okay, so if we've established that the tools are only going to be roughly right, precisely wrong, I recommend everybody use the GAF tool. It's a great way to learn, because one thing that Richard's done, which is to his credit, is he hasn't hidden any of the calculations, hasn't hidden any of the tabs. So if you really want to, you can follow through how something is calculated and the assumptions that are used at the national level to do those calculations. All of that is available and open to you, so you can see those calculations and how they're done. Downside, obviously, with Excel is that if you inadvertently delete a cell, none of the cells are protected. So if you delete a cell, you're buggered. Please don't use drop and drag. So don't put a number in and then drag the number down. It will bugger up certain things in it, I can guarantee you. And then it's a hell of a job to unpick it when you get all these error messages coming up. So enter data in rather than enter one bit in and then drag it down for 5 or 6 other numbers. Just a bit of a hint. All right, if we start with the livestock calculators that we've got, ticket items. There's a lot of information that's needed in the calculators. Some of them matter more than others. And if you get some of them wrong, it doesn't matter what you do with 10 of the little ticket items, won't make a difference if you bugger up one of the big ones. For livestock, the sort of information that you need is the number of animals, and that might sound odd, but I've done stuff in Northern Australia where they don't even know how many animals they've got running around on the place, so it's a bit hard to do an account if you don't know how many animals you've got. So the number of animals that you've got in different classes during the year, and you'll see what those different classes are. They're basically split up on age group and on sex, is those different classes. Ideally monthly. When the calculators first came out, they came out seasonally, and everybody was making mistakes in it, because if you had animals and you sold them in the first of 3 months, you would enter in, just by natural thinking. So if I had 100 steers and I sold them in September of springtime, you would say you had 100 steers in spring and then none in summer. In fact, because you only had them in September and you had 0 in October and 0 in November, spring should have actually gone in as 33 1/3 steers that you had in springtime. So everybody was buggering up the calculations of those numbers. So the calculator got expanded so you could do it monthly, which allowed more precision in the way things were being calculated. So number of animals and class of animals during the year is important. The weight of those animals is important as well. Now, I reckon most people are sitting there groaning, going, shit, I've got no idea the weight of my animals. But that more and more becomes a very important number to try and get a handle on. Okay. And from that, another calculation that's required is the live weight change of those animals each month. But if you've got reasonable weights, then you can get your live weights pretty accurately. A lot of people make mistakes that the weight of the animals and the live weight that they put in is different. So animals have gained 30 kilos in a month and you say they've gained 1.5 kilos a day, which would be 45 kilos in a month. So the weight of the animals and the weight gain doesn't match up. Lactation is also important, and when this commences. And in the livestock one, the quality of the feed. Now, there are default values that are entered for the quality of the feed, and the quantity of feed is only in the sheep calculator, not in the beef calculator, for odd reasons. But only one of them has that in it as well. So we need to just have a bit of a check of the quality and the quantity of feed on offer as part of that. Another big ticket item is the purchase of fodder, livestock and grain. They have a big implication in the livestock calculator. And the final one is the use of lime, because that again has a big impact, which I'll drill into in a little while. Probably notice things like chemical, electricity aren't on there. Fuel isn't on there. I can tell you they are very tiny compared to the impact that these numbers have on the final calculation. So if you're a little bit out in the litres of diesel or the litres of petrol that you've used, or how many kilowatt hours of electricity you've used, you'll hardly notice it in your calculator. But if you're out by 10 or 15 animals, or the weight of those animals is 50 kilos heavier than it should be, then you'll notice it and it will come up in your calculations. So I flag these at the start because it gets people thinking about how good their records are in being able to enter this accurately or with some degree of integrity. And I haven't found anybody yet that's nailed this when they first start. Everybody will have deficiencies in the numbers that they've got. Okay, when we do the calculation, this is the output that you'll get. So you'll get an output, and sorry, that looks a bit fuzzy, but you'll get your outputs. So this is the beef and sheep calculator. So it's got a column for beef and it's got a column for sheep. If you're running 2 or 3 different sheep enterprises in these calculators, you can only do one at a time. So if you've got, or if you've say got a beef operation and you've got an autumn calving herd and a spring calving herd, it's difficult to put both of them in one. So sometimes you've got to run multiple calculators, which is just a pain. But it will give you your scope 1 emissions broken up from what's producing carbon dioxide, what's producing methane, and what's producing nitrous oxide, and those different sources of the scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions, it'll just pick up electricity in that one. And then the scope 3 emissions is the stuff that you buy in. And you'll see the different products or different inputs that they will calculate. There's obviously some things that are missing out of that. It will then, if you had trees in it, there's a tab in there that you put trees in by. Usually try and turn that to 0. And I just get my net farm emissions, and then it will calculate out an emissions intensity number down the bottom. So that's kilograms per kilogram of live weight in this case. Also give you a graph at the side, which gives you what are the different sources. And as you can see in this mock example I've put in here, 3/4 of it is methane, enteric methane, and quite a bit because this one's got a trading operation and I've bought livestock in. So that's a scope 3 that's coming there. So they're the big ticket items in it. You look at things like electricity and stuff like that, fuels 1%. Getting it a bit wrong doesn't really matter much. What else have we got in here? Okay, just a couple of things in the livestock. I might actually get everybody to, if they could go and just open up the livestock calculator. And I'll do that myself. I'll stop sharing and I'll go to in the pack of stuff that I've given you. So in your bundle of stuff, should be 9.2, and hopefully when it opens up, it'll open up on that tab. Now, have you guys got a Word document out there now?
Yep.
Yep, okay. All right, so this Word document, which is also called 9.2 example farm, livestock, cattle. And I should say I've got similar examples for cropping and a similar example for sheep as well. This is example if I'm working through with people to show them how the tool works, I will give them an example like this. And so in this case here, it's a self-replacing herd that's got 300 cows, standard reference weight 550, bulls, time of when they do all of that sort of stuff. Okay, and I'll make it pretty simple. I don't have animals dying. So I'll try and simplify the way the model needs to be put together. Okay, so running parallel to the inputs that you've got in that Excel spreadsheet is this document with the information in it. Okay. And if we go down further, it's got things like the live weights of those animals for you to put that stuff in. Okay. And then if you scroll down further, this is what different examples should look like, what your different screens should look like. So just to let you know, that's the background material that supports the Excel sheet that you're running through. Okay. I'll go back and now and step you through some of the key things that are in it. Okay, so hopefully everybody's got that sheet up in front of you. There are 2 or 3 really important tabs on it. This data summary, that's what I showed you before. This is the output or the results, if you like, from the calculator. The next tab along is the data input. So that is essentially the tab that you need to be using to enter your data into it. Okay. There is a similar one for sheep. In this case, it's got nothing in it because this is the beef only example, but you can do beef and sheep together in the same calculator. It then has another tab along there, which is the data input vegetation. I'm going to leave that for the moment. That's all set at 0, so it's not going to pick up any sequestration, but there are some severe limitations to this, which will... There's a whole lot of other tabs, and these are tabs that are used to calculate things like enteric fermentation. So these are all the equations that are used to do the calculation for. Okay, that's for the beef one, that's for the sheep one, it's for the manure management one, this is for the nitrous oxide losses and so on. So if you're really excited and you love nerdy fiddling around with spreadsheets and how things calculate, that's where all the calculations are done. If we go right to the end of all the tabs, there is one there which is the various, global warming potential factors. So these are the numbers we were talking about before. Those numbers potentially are going to change, which means all the calculator will then change as a result. It's also got notes right at the end. These are all the times in which cells have been changed and why. So when you get different versions of it and they change it, they will say which tab has been changed. Quite often the reason what the reference is behind that change as part of it. Okay, so it's just more for an advisor point of view to know if a change has been made and you want to know what change have they made from version X to version Y. You can look up that log at the back. Could I get everybody go to the data input for the beef one, please? Right. There are 3 very important bits of information that you need to enter in the top, because what you enter up here alters a whole lot of default values that are put into the calculator. The first one up here is just asks you what name for your farm, so that's got nothing much to do with it. Then it asks you what state are you from. Up a couple of things. It loads up things related to runoff and leaching of nitrogen, nitrous oxide that comes out of plant material as it breaks down, but most importantly, the quality and the quantity of the feed that's on offer in that state every month or every season. So it's actually quite a influential one, and we certainly found this for South Australia. If you click South Australia, it gives you a generic quality numbers, which for some people in the southeast that have pastures that are pretty similar to Western Victoria, you'll notice the numbers are quite different as far as the default quality values go. My suggestion would be, if you're in South Australia in that southeast where Flick is operating, that you're probably better to be using the Victorian, so put Victoria in for your state rather than South Australia. Okay. You can override those if you want, but just as a bit of a trick, you'll find a difference between those. So we'll just leave it Victoria at the moment because that's the way I'd set it up for this other example I've got. Then there are 2 other questions over on the right-hand side here. is your property north of the Tropic of Capricorn? And that's a yes/no answer that you've got there. And the second one is, does your farm get enough rainfall or irrigation to drain through the soil profile that is typically above 600 millimetres? This is a question about nitrogen leaching, runoff and leaching through the profile with nitrogen, so nitrogen products. I generally answer no to that, even in the 600 mil rainfall zone, unless we've had a very wet year. It makes a significant difference to the final output when you answer yes or no. And I think in a lot of cases, penalising farms that really don't have much runoff, if any at all, from nitrogen quite severely. So I tend to, unless you're in a very high rainfall zone, I would be answering no to both of those rather than yes to the second one. Okay. Now, if we look at the actual setup of the table, and I've given you the monthly one here, it does 12 months of the year, starting in July and finishing in June. And it asks for these classes of livestock. As you can see, they're based on sex and age. So bulls greater than 1 year old, steers less than 1 to 2, greater than 2, cows greater than 2, heifers less than 1, heifers 1 to 2, and so on. This is considered for a breeding operation, or what you might call more a self-replacing type operation. The classifications of the names are just made up based on ABARES data, because that's what they had at the state level. So they knew how many steers greater than 2 year old in July were in Victoria. So they put those numbers in to do the national calculation. None of these names really matter much except for the cows. So the cows, and if you're doing another livestock one with ewes, that matters because this column is linked behind the seeds to lactation. Okay, and the calculation in there will be affected if you put your cows in that column rather than that column. But if you put 2 year old steers in that column and 1 to 2 year old steers in that column, it won't make any difference. So there's a bit of a quirk that just any of your lactating breeding animals need to be in that column. If we go across a little bit further, you've got trade cattle as well, but effectively with the trade cattle, you can pick any name you want. It doesn't make any difference from that point of view. So you can override and put different names in there. They're not all steers that you might be trading. The information that they ask for are your livestock numbers each month and the weight of those animals. And those two factors are super important, which I'll show you in a tick in some graphs of how that actually influences your output. The biggest mistake that people make, and I've highlighted it here in the beef one, is that once an animal gets, so say if you've got a steer that is born in August, so you're calving in August and you've got 150 of them that are calving down, let's say, and you keep those steers, those 1 year old steers, 150 of them, because you've got 300 cows calving and we're assuming 100% calving. So you've got 150 boys and 150 girls coming out of those 150 calves. When they get to 12 months old, those numbers then flick across into the next age category, because once you get to this point here, they've actually turned into 13-month-old animals. So they change the column that they're sitting in. This is the biggest mistake I find people make, is they don't get their livestock numbers in their inventory correct. So they have very unusual numbers in here, and that makes an enormous difference to your final calculation. So this example here, we've got 150 steers that all calved down in the month, which was pretty handy of us. Once we got to June, we culled 10 of them. We said 10 of those pretty shit out, so we've only got 140 left. 140 steers that are 12 months old, then they become 13 months old, so they transfer to the 1 to 2 year old age group, and we keep them until they're about 16 months old. Then we sell about half of them in the first intake, so they're being sold to market. Then the second lot in December, so we have none left in January, and so we have 0 through for the rest of the year before the next lot of 140 come in the next year later. Exactly the same with the heifers. You've got heifers, if you've had 150 of them, we'll get rid of 10 of them, that's 140. They then jump to the 1 to 2 year old groups, but because we're self-replacing, we go through, we cull a few more on the way through there, we keep 126 of them. And once they get to there, they then become greater than 2 year old and they go back into the main herd. This calculation in the livestock game is the hardest thing to do and to get right. I'm yet to see anybody that's filled it out first time and got it right. Okay, so just be aware of that. As an advisor, you need to be pretty good at understanding how these animals shift and move around and when they change their age for the sex that they are. So when they go from a 1 to 2 year old heifer, if you're keeping them, they then become a greater than 2 year old cow after 2 years. And it's the shifting of those numbers around that's super important. Okay, I'll just leave that as far as the calculation goes. We can come back to that when you have a bit of a play with it. You then need a similar table of the weight of those animals. Okay, so if we follow this same example through when those cows are calving, and so we've got these young steers, I'm saying they're born at 40 kilos and they gain about 1 kilo a day, which is what's happening running through there, to 310, and then as they hit 12 months old, they're 330. Then they transfer across, as we've done there, transfer those animals across, so their weight then goes across, and now they're 350. And they reach about 450 kilos before we sell them. And then their weights go to 0, and that's why you've got a 0, and then all of a sudden it jumps up to 350. Okay, now I reckon a lot of you will be sitting there going, I don't know how people are going to have these numbers. And you're dead right, most people don't. Okay, it's a data intensive thing to try and get right. And if people haven't been thinking about collecting this data, in a lot of cases, they won't have it. And so telling people just go back and do your numbers for the last few years, I can tell you is diabolically hard in livestock, unless you've got incredibly good numbers. So I usually say to people, know what they are today and we'll move forward on that. And I'll come back to that point. The way this calculator is built is that it has an automatic calculation for weight gain. You know, I mentioned some people get their weight gain wrong. It's got an automatic calculation for weight gain, but it does some really funky things when you do things like you've got animals that are 450 kilos, you sell them, and therefore the weights the next month are 0 because you don't have any animals. It's suggested there that those animals have lost 15 kilos a day. I mean, if they were doing that, they'd be dead. Okay, so there are these funny quirks with the way the calculator is set up that, in a sense, almost embeds these mistakes. And similar thing here is that we've gone, that number there is taken from those two. So it said those animals in that first month have gained 11.67 kilos a day, which we know they have. So as an advisor, you just need to look through something like this and pick up the howlers. No, I know there's something wrong there. They haven't lost 9.3 kilos a day. But some of these, losing 0.3 of a kilo a day, losing 1 kilo a day of a bull on dry feed, that's possible. So you've just got to cast your eye across and pick up the mistakes that are in the obvious mistakes and do it, in a sense, a longhand calculation to know what that number should be. Okay, 2 other bits of information here, crude protein and dry matter digestibility, which is important. Those 2 numbers, they're in grey when you pick the state. So if I'd picked a different state, I'd pick South Australia, for example, go down there, these numbers have changed. Okay, in the calculator, because they're just being driven off lookup tables. So if you look at that and go, I know in springtime the crude protein is not 7% in my pastures, okay, you would change that. So if I pop this back to Victoria, crude protein is now 20%, which is more like what it would be. Okay. So hopefully you're getting a bit of a flavour that as you work through this, you will find there are these heaps of odd things the calculator does. it does these odd things at the farm scale that we're operating at because nationally that's the best data they had, so that's what they use. In the livestock one, you've also got any animals that you purchase. So you put in the number of animals you purchased and the weight of those per head. It asks you where you source them from, because this is about the Scope 3 emissions. And if you look at that drop-down list that you've got, they're either from dairy, whatever dairy means, north, south, or central Queensland, north, south, New South Wales, Victoria, or southern South Australia, southern South Australia is all considered one, and the SA pastoral zone is considered different. So it's incredibly crude in the way it calculates your Scope 3 if you're purchasing animals in. It's also got your sales, so they're purchases, these are your sales. And then it asks a few other things there. So you just put in your sales, the number of animals, and your sale weight. And so in this case here, we sold 140 steers, they averaged 450. So in fact, we got rid of 63,000 kilos of live weight as our sales. Ask you things like when those cows are calving, because what this does is it'll click on lactation. It also asks you things around mineral supplementation, mainly because some of those mineral supplements use urea and you get pinged for nitrous oxide losses in the urea that you're using. It asks you some stuff around here around different fertilizers and around things like lime that's being used, if you've used any lime. A couple of things just to note on this. The lime is the total quantity, not how much per hectare you've put out. It's a total quantity across the farm. And the fraction does not refer to the purity of it. The fraction refers to how much of that is limestone compared to dolomite lime. Just a dumb wording. So where I've got fraction 1, that means all the lime I spread was limestone. If you had spread dolomite lime, believe it or not, so the fraction would have been 0, and it automatically calculates the purity of dolomite lime for you and gives you an emissions on that. So it's just another dumb thing that's in there. It's only a number between 0 and 1. It then asks for a whole lot of other inputs there, active ingredients for your chemicals, and that's where that little chemical calculator I showed you comes into it. How much feed you've purchased, electricity, fuel, and so on. Savanna burning, you can ignore that. If you click on Victoria, it doesn't take any notice of any of the numbers that you fill, any of the data you fill out in there. So that's the requirements for the livestock one. And it's certainly time to pause and understand those bits of data and how important they are. Okay, I find the livestock one infinitely harder than the cropping one to get that calculator right, particularly in the movement of those livestock numbers each month and where they're going and the corresponding weights that go with it. But unfortunately, there's no easy way out of it from a livestock point of view. It's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. I'll go back now to my presentation. This one. As we'll go through this, then we might have a bit of a break, Emma, and people can have a bit of a talk and a play, and then we'll jump onto the cropping one. Okay, so I've mentioned that one about the changing of livestock numbers when they go in, and that we've got incorrect numbers there. The way methane is calculated, which is our biggest emission by an absolute mile, the calculation that works out how much emissions an animal puts out is this calculation here. Okay, so it's weight, so that's why I said weight was important to try and get right. So it calculates weight, weight squared, and then live weight gain, and that's why these two really need to correspond, and whether the animal's lactating or not. So based on that information you put in, it calculates and says an animal eats this much a day. Okay, based on the type of animal that it is. and then the methane that it produces is 20.7 times how much it eats. So 20.7 times this equation up here. Don't expect anybody to remember the equation or worry too much about the equation, except take note of what information is actually driving this calculation. And it's the weight of the animal in any month and its change in weight, or its live weight gain. That's what's important with the cattle side of the calculation. Okay, and that's what drives your methane, and methane will be 85% of your final number. So those two are super important. So if we don't get those calculations right, you will find that you'll be getting numbers that are either markedly too high or too low to make a difference. Just to emphasize that, I've just got a couple of graphs here just very quickly. So this is, and these are in your notes, the change in the animal weights. So this is how fast the animal is growing, basically. So that's weight gain or weight loss. That's maintenance. And this is the amount of methane that's calculated that those animals put out. If you said you had a 500 kilo cow and she was maintaining condition, she'd be producing about 160, 165 grams of methane a day. But if you said, no, she's a bit heavier than that, she weighs 600 kilos, then she's likely to be putting out about 180 grams. So that's about 15% more in emissions per day in methane that cow is putting out simply because you've changed her weight. So knowing her weight's pretty important. And you can see that the more they grow, the more emissions they have, because the only way they can grow is to eat more, is the way the calculation works. And so the more they eat, the more emissions that they'll have. But you'll notice on the line, if you've got an animal that can, let's say it's a 300 kilo animal here, a weaner that's growing, and it's gaining about 1 kilo a day, it's producing 135 grams of methane. If it was only gaining half a kilo a day, it's producing about 125. But if you wanted those animals to gain 1 kilo, the 1 kilo a day one does it in 1 day with 135 grams of emissions. This one is grams of emission. The message to take home out of this is the faster you can make animals grow and the quicker you can turn them off, the lower your emissions will be. So when we start looking at what are your options, it is all about growth and rapid turn off. If you want to lower that emissions number, get them to grow as fast as possible. And these graphs just emphasize that. So I use these sometimes, particularly with livestock guys that are really keen to actually understand how the whole job works. The sheep one's a bit different, but it's similar principle that it calculates an intake value, but in this case here it works on digestibility as well as live weight of the animal. Okay, so quality of feed becomes important with the sheep one, as does quantity of feed, where it doesn't in the cattle one. And your methane is based on a slightly different equation. Gives you the amount of methane that you produce. And so getting these numbers wrong again makes a big difference. Can probably skip over that one, or both of those. They're in the notes, but it's just showing the impact of some of these if you get your numbers a bit wrong. For example, at a 65 kilo animal, if it's got 1,000 kilos of feed on offer, it produces 25 grams of methane. If it's got 500 kilos, it produces 12 grams of methane. So you'll see that changes over time. And so common mistakes is getting just live weights and stuff like that wrong. Yeah. So the consistency, I can tell you, you'll get a slightly different methane calculation out of grass feed that you would out of this. Partly because the grass feed one is more nuanced in the way you can describe the animal. And these calculations are pretty clunky because that's the best that they had to do calculations at a national level. So when you saw that big bar graph that there was heaps of methane and that's the formula they use to calculate it. But they're talking about, you know, X many millions of animals eating this quality feed, and a cow in Victoria, every cow in Victoria weighs 550 kilos. Okay, so that's the way the calculations are done. They're all shown in those reports, but it won't be precise for an individual farm if you then wanted to compare it to grass feed to see if the methane emissions are exactly the same. So it simply won't be, because it's just not good enough. Okay, it's just something, unfortunately, we have to live with because of the origins of where that calculator's come from, and to get that acceptance in the international community. That's part of what everybody's trying to juggle with, you know, because you go to the US and they calculate it slightly differently. So whose do you believe? And do we let every country do their own thing? No, they said, no, this is a standard way. We're going to try and calculate to compare against each other. We've just inherited that general calculation. Okay, it's not miles out, but it's not as accurate as what, say, a grass feed would. If you could put quality and quantity of feed in and a perfect description of the class of livestock you've got.